Hello again, mud pig wrestlers, or whatever you are. Here's one of those things that I referred to in the introduction with Russell's quip about philosophy being about something that's so obvious that it doesn't need saying, but in the end gets you tying yourself up in knots about it. Let me tell you the story. In a comments section on an internet video, somebody commented that a lot of young Russian military-age men were fleeing Russia to avoid military service. As it happens, one of the guys that I follow on YouTube to try to learn Russian has done exactly that. So I know that happens, that fits with the claim. I should know better by now, but I replied in the comments, and also some Ukrainians, to which the guy said, well, I haven't seen any. And I said, well, I have. Some Ukrainians arrived in my village here in Spain. Some of them were military age. I met them. They were on the train station waiting for the train. I sputtered my Russian at them. So I can confidently say that unless I was on some heavy hallucinatory drug, at least some young Ukrainian men also left the country. Now, the other chap then replied, well, I didn't see any, so that just goes to show you can't trust what you see. At this point I think the conversation's ended here. There is a fallacy, surely, isn't there, in that point of view? If you're claiming that something exists, but you haven't seen any of them in your village, and I'm claiming that something exists and I have seen them in my village, then doesn't that override that lovely backwards E that they use in logic? There exist these people. I mean, I would have thought that was obvious, but let's go over it. Let's imagine it is an ideal world, and not only do they teach you statistics and how they trick you in the ideal schools of the future, they might also do rhetoric, could bring that back. They're definitely going to teach you logic. And this is basic, isn't it? It's a little road that's going to lead us to Russell's teapot, and it starts with Aristotle. He had it worked out that if P implies Q and P is true, then Q must be true. That's like by the rules of the game, isn't it? If you don't like that format, just think of it as if P then Q. That's the way I learned it. If P then Q, P, therefore Q. And I like to use the example in my little head of raining and floors getting wet. So here that's if it rains the floor gets wet. It has rained, therefore, yeah, that's pretty easy. How about if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. If it rains the floor gets wet, the same as before. The floor isn't wet, therefore, yeah, we've got it. That wasn't difficult. The first one was called modus ponens and the second one is called modus tollens. There's a putting logical construct and there's a taking away logical construct, sort of. But wait, let philosophy weave its magic and let's look at some of the invalid forms of these very, very simple logical statements. Let's go to the modus ponens. If it rains, the floor gets wet. It hasn't rained, therefore the floor hasn't got wet. But wait a minute, somebody just kicked a bucket of water over onto it, and it did get wet. Now we'll do the other one. If it rains, the floor gets wet. The floor is wet, therefore it's rained. Oh no, there's that bucket again. So it seemed pretty obvious, but you can also see how people fall into a trap because the forms are pretty similar. The first trap there is known as affirming the consequent and the second trap is denying the antecedent. Now that should be that, but there exists this sort of meme, if you like, that you can't prove a negative. So let's just have a little look at that and see where people might be going wrong there. Internet atheist rationality rules talks about God and being able to prove his existence or not. This is where a lot of opinions come rushing in. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, says some. And you're claiming that God exists is a pretty extraordinary claim. Some people who believe in God would say he's beyond comprehension. And another favourite, the burden of proof is not on me. And this is where Russell's teapot comes in. If you say that there's a teapot orbiting, was it Mars? I can't remember. A planet. Anyway, doesn't matter. It's always on the other side of the planet. It's always hidden from us. It's just a teapot, just floating around there. Then I have the choice of saying, well, okay, I'm ready to believe you. Maybe you sent a satellite up there, but you know, I doubt it. I'd rather you showed me some evidence. Yeah, a little photograph or something like that. But, as Rationality Rules points out, there is a difference between that kind of statement and saying Russell's teapot is, at the same time, entirely made of tin and entirely made of copper. Do we really need to logically unpick that to find a way that you could say, aha, I've proved a negative, I've proved that it's not entirely made of tin? Let's just note the kind of thing we're talking about here. Karl Popper is famous for the falsification principle. He said that in science, you don't say this is true and will be forever. You say, this is what we think is true now, and I will give you some conditions under which you can prove that it isn't true. And that's known as falsification. But look at these claims we're making here. They're claims about God. They are extraordinary claims. The late great James Randi, great mentalist and debunker of mentalists, insisted that he was not debunking, he was, quote, investigating. Why? Because you can't prove telepathy doesn't exist. He's just asking people to prove that it does exist. It would similarly be difficult to prove that Santa Claus doesn't exist. In fact, you could marshal all the evidence you like. All you need is Santa Claus to appear somewhere, even just, I don't know, out shopping in a mall somewhere, and somebody say, look, there he is. And I'd say, I was wrong. If Santa did exist, you could find evidence, you could prove it. It's very likely that he doesn't. You can't find evidence to prove that he doesn't. So why is it me that's in a corner? This is a little bit like the archaeologist's creed that says, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. When you're digging around in those old soils, you can't say for sure certain kind of pottery never arrived in this area because you haven't found one. Oh, I should mention Neil deGrasse Tyson trying to tell me that he's proved that there isn't a crocodile in a box or something similar by opening the box and showing me there isn't a crocodile in the box. Well, as you've seen, these kinds of more limited statements are not as interesting as whether telepathy or ghosts or God or parallel universes exist. So I think there's a bedrock, and here we go back to Wittgenstein again, it's all forms of life, isn't it? There's a kind of human expectation of what's possible. We won't go into the sum of the degrees of the interior angles of a triangle, we'll save that little treat for another day. In any case, I'm sure it hasn't, but I hope that's cleared things up. I would like to just leave it with my example, the one that I have in my head, in an attempt to show this, is that imagine you've got a betting game, and it's just a simple, I bet the next person who walks in the room is wearing a green jumper, or something like that, or is a woman in a blue coat, and you sort your odds out, you could pass the time of day doing that. Somebody might say, I bet that the next person to enter in the room will be a vampire on a sleigh wearing a trilby. And there, you're not in the realms of, I bet the next thing that comes in the room will be a triangle with 4 sides. I mean, you can imagine a vampire on a sleigh wearing a trilby. It's just not very likely, is it? Actually, that's not so much form of life as my old friend Protagoras. Man is the measure, but beware black swans.